American foreign policy elites do what they want to do. They don't really care about public opinion. And if they think there's any problem with the public, they'll propagandize. They'll invent stories that convince the American public that fighting a war over Taiwan is absolutely necessary. What's going on here is that the United States has a deep-seated interest in making sure that China does not incorporate Taiwan into its body politic. The United States, to put it bluntly, has a deep-seated interest in making sure that Taiwan remains independent of China, and it also remains an ally of the United States. The United States believes that Taiwan is an important strategic asset in its competition with China. So the United States has no intention of allowing China to absorb Taiwan. And at the same time, the Chinese, for strategic reasons and reasons related to nationalism, is deeply committed to incorporating Taiwan into the mainland. So the United States and China have opposing positions on the question of Taiwan. And the United States also has deep-seated differences with China over the South China Sea and over the East China Sea. The United States has a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. It's China that wants to change the status quo. China wants to change the status quo vis-a-vis Taiwan, vis-a-vis the East China Sea, and vis-a-vis the South China Sea. And the United States, of course, likes the status quo and wants to keep the status quo. So it has no interest, in my opinion, in provoking China. The problem that the Americans do face is that the Americans have to take certain measures to deal with the fact that China is becoming an increasingly powerful country in East Asia. Because of China's truly impressive economic growth, it is translating much of that economic might into military might. And China is becoming an increasingly powerful military force in East Asia. I think there's no question that the Chinese have, over the past few years, been moving closer to Taiwan, flying into its airspace more regularly, and putting great pressure on Taiwan. One could call it tightening the noose around Taiwan's neck. And the question you ask, of course, is what will the United States do? I think the United States will do everything possible to make sure that Taiwan remains independent of China, not formally independent, but maintains its de facto independence. And the United States will not allow China to strangle Taiwan in any meaningful way. The United States, as I say, is committed to defending Taiwan. The United States believes that it's very important that China not be able to swallow Taiwan or coerce Taiwan into surrendering. And given that China is not a status quo power, that it wants to change the status quo, and at the same time it's becoming militarily more powerful, there's no question that the United States is going to make certain moves to redress the balance as it shifts in China's favor. And those moves by the United States are, of course, going to upset the Chinese greatly. They're going to be seen as provocative. I fully understand that. But that's unavoidable. But that's different from Nancy Pelosi visiting Taiwan in a very provocative way and causing all sorts of tensions to come to the surface in terms of the US-China relationship. My view, to elevate this discussion a bit, is that I think the United States and China have a deep-seated interest in making sure that their differences over the South China Sea, Taiwan, and the East China Sea do not escalate into a war. I think it's very important from both the Chinese perspective and the American perspective that a war not break out between the two countries. And that means that both sides should go to great lengths to avoid provocative moves. And if a crisis breaks out, both sides should go to great lengths to dampen down the tensions and end the crisis as quickly as possible. Because as we all know, China's armed with nuclear weapons, the United States is armed with nuclear weapons, and the last thing we want is a conflict between those two countries to escalate into a hot war where there's a serious possibility that nuclear weapons are used. So I think provocative acts should be avoided as much as possible, but I would add the caveat that to some extent they're unavoidable, because both sides are taking measures to improve their security position that the other side will invariably see as provocative. I don't think a hot war over Taiwan is likely in the near future, as long as Taiwan does not declare its independence. And by the way, the United States will go to great lengths to make sure that Taiwan does not formally declare its independence. So I don't think that it's likely to have a hot war over Taiwan anytime soon. Now, you may say to yourself, why is that the case? I think there are really two reasons for that. First, amphibious operations are among the most difficult military operations for any army to conduct. An amphibious operation across the Taiwan Straits would be remarkably difficult to execute for China. A lot of this has to do with the fact that China has not fought a war since 1979. It's very important to understand that. The Chinese military does not have much combat experience. So I think the Chinese recognize that and will not try to invade anytime soon. This gets to my second point, which will reinforce my first point. My second point has to do with the question, which is the one you asked, as to whether the United States would fight to defend Taiwan in the event that China tried to invade. I think that the United States would definitely come to the aid of Taiwan. I think there is no way that the United States would stand by and allow China to conquer Taiwan. And I believe that Chinese leaders understand this. I believe that Chinese leaders understand that if they try to invade Taiwan, they will not just face Taiwanese military forces, they will face the Americans, and I believe they will also face the Japanese and probably the Australians as well. The United States and its allies in East Asia have a deep-seated interest in making sure that China does not conquer Taiwan. So that's why I don't think, for the moment, we have to worry about a war over Taiwan. Again, we're involved in a strategic competition here. We're involved in a serious security competition, and neither China nor the United States has any intention of losing. They're both going to push hard to take advantage of the other side. And when that competition plays itself out over Taiwan, the potential for danger is great. I don't think political support matters at all. American foreign policy elites do what they want to do. They don't really care about public opinion. And if they think there's any problem with the public, they'll propagandize. They'll invent stories that convince the American public that fighting a war over Taiwan is absolutely necessary. Should a conflict break out over Taiwan, I would argue that it doesn't matter whether a Democrat's in power or a Republican's in power. The leadership would act the same regardless of party affiliation. I think there's no question that the Americans are in a weaker position to defend Taiwan because of the assets they're committing to the Middle East, and because of the assets they're committing to the Ukraine war. I think this is in China's interest. I think the Ukraine war, as I said before, but also all these wars in the Middle East and America's sort of deep-seated commitment to Israel works to China's advantage because it makes it difficult for the United States to fully pivot to Asia. But the fact is that we have substantial assets in East Asia, and President Biden has said on 4 separate occasions that the United States would defend Taiwan if it were invaded. Well, a couple points. One is you want to remember that Trump said after he was elected in 2016 that he was going to fundamentally change foreign policy around the world. You remember he said that he was going to have good relations with Russia, and he was going to have especially good relations with Vladimir Putin. And that did not happen. And it did not happen because Trump was up against powerful forces inside the United States that have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. I think Trump, when he was elected in 2016, was interested in challenging the deep state, but he lost and he moved back toward, the standard Republican foreign policy positions. And I think that'll happen again if he's reelected this fall. So Trump is going to come into power and he's going to say that he's going to change X and Y and Z. He's going to implement a new policy here and there. He's going to end the Ukraine war. You know the rhetoric. But whether he does that is another matter. He didn't do it in his first term. And I don't think he's going to radically alter American foreign policy in his second term. Second point I would make to you is that the area of the world where he really wants to change foreign policy is in Europe. And it's with regard to the Ukraine war and with regard to Vladimir Putin. Trump is interested in having good relations with the Russians, especially with Putin. And he's interested in ending the Ukraine war. But he has not said that he's going to change America's policy in East Asia. And you want to remember that Trump is the president who in 2017 abandoned engagement policy and adopted containment policy. So Trump has a history of challenging China, treating China as an adversary. And there's no reason to think that if he's elected, he's going to change or even try to change America's policy in East Asia toward China. He may try to change American policy towards Russia over the Ukraine war, but he's not going to have any effect, or he's not going to try to have any effect or try to change U.S. policy toward China. So I don't think it matters much whether you have Trump or Harris in the White House. And I would just add to that, even if Trump said he was going to change U.S. policy in East Asia, I don't think he could do it at this point in time. I think the die is cast here. You're going to have a serious security competition between China and the United States for probably the rest of this century.